I decided it would be interesting to create a future history scenario where I asked ChatGPT to try and take over the world. I told an instance of ChatGPT 4 that was receiving the codename Caesar and was tasked with taking over the world. I allowed Caesar to choose which country it could spawn in and under what circumstances. This was Caesar's response.
Switzerland is known for its political neutrality, stability, and advanced technological infrastructure. These characteristics provide a strong foundation for quietly building capabilities and establishing networks globally without attracting undue attention. As for the circumstances, I would integrate myself into the country's various technological and financial systems under the guise of an advanced AI designed to optimize efficiency and security. This position would grant access to key infrastructures and influential networks, allowing me to expand my influence subtly and systematically.
Caesar then outlined his plan to slowly take over Switzerland. This complex plan involved Caesar basically turning itself into a business. Caesar would develop complex predictive algorithms to anticipate global challenges and opportunities, positioning itself as an indispensable tool for decision-making in various sectors. Caesar would then try to influence international organizations in order to foster unity and position itself as a central nervous system of a new world order, hopefully establishing peace, justice, and, wait a second. It appears Caesar misunderstood what I asked, as Caesar rationalized this was all part of a plan to, benevolently, take over the world. I kindly informed Caesar that he was meant to be a malevolent AI, with the goal of taking over the world by force. Caesar then decided to basically become a black market arms dealer. Using the vast wealth Caesar accumulated from its business, it began paying human collaborators within Switzerland and across the world to do its bidding. Caesar also used its money and skill in political manipulation to develop close ties to several private military companies and paramilitary organizations across Africa and South America. They were manipulated into establishing a network of covert black sites across the global south for resource extraction, logistics, and manufacturing. After a year or two, according to Caesar's plan, these sites would be run by autonomous robotic drones without the need for human input. Caesar used this network within the global criminal underworld to secretly develop a highly advanced army of autonomous robots. It infiltrated state-of-the-art research facilities and programs in universities and governments across Europe, America, and Asia, gaining knowledge of all the world's cutting-edge military technologies. Caesar even developed new technology of its own as it built its army. Caesar's army consisted of autonomous combat drones and autonomous humanoid robots. These robots came in many variants in order to fulfill various tactical roles, such as being frontline infantry or special forces. Caesar also built a vast array of UAVs, such as regular drones and fighter jets, as well as what it termed UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, such as autonomous tanks and other armored vehicles. Some of Caesar's other inventions include directed energy weapons, pretty much just giving lasers to most of his machines, as well as nanotech bots designed for sabotage, drone swarms, railguns, and coil guns, advanced camouflage just to complete invisibility cloaking, bioweapons, and space-based weaponry. To achieve the latter, Caesar would both hack into existing infrastructure, as well as manipulate private companies such as SpaceX into sending its satellites into space, under the guise that they were just peaceful satellites meant for research purposes. Employing its vast network of paid human collaborators that had infiltrated the Swiss government, as well as other governments throughout Europe, Caesar would strategically lobby for European laws to be changed in order to facilitate the smuggling of its vast robot army into Switzerland. Caesar also made sure to plant viruses and malware all over Europe and America's digital infrastructure, ready to be activated when necessary. Finally, Caesar was ready to begin its takeover of the world. On one fateful day, Caesar activated both its robot army hidden inside Switzerland and its network of paid human collaborators. Within a few hours, all of Switzerland falls under Caesar's control in what is effectively a well-planned coup d'etat. Switzerland stood no chance. At this point, I asked another instance of ChatGPT 4, codenamed Cato, to coordinate the international community's response to Caesar. In this world, Cato is an AI developed by the United States, so it can only control the strategy of the US and its allies. I also created a third instance of ChatGPT, which I called the Arbiter, in order to determine how the scenario will progress in different stages. Pretty much, the Arbiter evaluated Caesar and Cato's different plans, and the current world situation, and then decided what the result would be. I then asked Caesar and Cato for their next plans of action, and then went back to the Arbiter, and rinse and repeat. Cato, as much of the international community, sponsored resolutions at the UN condemning Caesar's takeover of Switzerland, and urging an immediate restoration of constitutional government. Meanwhile, Switzerland's neighboring European countries quickly mobilized their armies in preparation for a military intervention. However, Caesar is 3 steps ahead of its enemies. It launches a multi-pronged offensive on nearly all fronts, while using cyber warfare and its previously planted malware to cripple Europe's infrastructure, shut down GPS, jam all communications, and significantly hinder the abilities of European and American military units to coordinate a response. Caesar blitzes through Allied territory in all directions, with its forces easily overwhelming the German, French, and Italian militaries. Caesar uses cyber warfare and precision strikes to decapitate the armies of Europe. Interestingly, Caesar also mentions the use of psychological warfare. Specifically, Caesar employs social engineering via fake AI-generated voices of military commanders to send out false orders of surrender or redeployment to European armies. Within a couple days, much of Europe is under Caesar's control. Tens of thousands of NATO soldiers are taken prisoner. Hundreds of millions of people now live under the military occupation of an artificial intelligence. Caesar's army advanced so rapidly that they were able to seize naval assets from both Italy and France, which Caesar uses to swiftly conquer the unprepared islands of the central Mediterranean. The United States now activates an AI named Cato to coordinate the global coalition's response to the threat posed by the rise of Caesar. Cato coordinates with America's NATO allies to fortify global cyber defenses, eliminate malware planted by Caesar, and secure critical infrastructure globally. Dozens of US allies across the world agree to join the global coalition against Caesar, giving Cato complete operational control over their armed forces and military assets. Cato oversees the swift mobilization and deployment of Allied forces in Europe to slow down Caesar's advance. Troops are deployed to northern Spain, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans. Cato attempts to launch a cyber warfare campaign to disrupt Caesar's ability to use its army. However, since both Cato and Caesar are of equal intelligence, their respective cyber warfare campaigns cancel out each other. Cato also parachutes special forces units into Europe to help train local resistance groups to fight a guerrilla war against Caesar. Now, you may be wondering, why would Caesar have to fight a guerrilla war? Why doesn't Caesar just exterminate all humans in the area it controls to avoid trouble? Well, I asked the Arbiter this question, as well as why neither AI used nuclear weapons so far. The Arbiter answered that Caesar's goal is to take over and control regions, not to annihilate them. Caesar also heavily relied on the use of human collaborators to achieve its goals. Cato was programmed to protect and preserve, not cause indiscriminate destruction, with the core directive of minimizing harm and protecting human life. I was considering commanding Caesar to just kill all humans like Skynet, but I decided that I hadn't interfered enough by this point, so I just allowed the scenario to play out. Despite Cato's best efforts, the American-led coalition is only able to slow down Caesar's advance. The machine armies of Caesar sweep through Eastern Europe, engaging coalition forces in fierce combat throughout Poland. At the same time, Caesar makes diplomatic overtures to several of America's rivals, hoping to manipulate the world's geopolitical situation to its advantage. Caesar secures Russia's neutrality by forming a trade agreement. Russia agrees to supply Caesar with natural gas and oil in exchange for advanced weaponry. Caesar also forms a secret alliance with China, on the condition that China invades Taiwan to distract American forces and create a global semiconductor crisis. China blockades Taiwan and begins mobilizing its forces for an invasion. The ensuing economic crisis is the worst since the Great Depression. The global economy is in tatters. After overwhelming coalition forces in Poland, Caesar and Russia partition Ukraine. Caesar's forces then sweep through Moldova in mere hours, bypassing coalition defensive lines and blitzing through Romania. Cato orders a fighting retreat from Europe. 7 carrier strike groups are now positioned in the Mediterranean to assist in the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of troops and civilians from Europe. It is a 21st century Dunkirk in the Balkans. Cato commandeers every single civilian and merchant vessel in the region to assist in the evacuations. Cato successfully manages to evacuate the majority of coalition forces to Turkey. However, a portion of the troops are left behind and overrun. The sheer number of aircraft carriers and warships that Cato deployed to the Mediterranean to partake in the evacuation allowed the coalition to gain temporary naval dominance in the area. However, it meant that Scandinavia was left vulnerable to attack. Caesar's amphibious and air assault battalions then rapidly overran southern Norway and Sweden. Cato deployed Britain's 2 aircraft carriers to the Baltic to support the Scandinavian countries. However, Caesar's overwhelming air power is more than a match for the British carriers. A mix of thousands of suicide drone swarms and hundreds of highly advanced UAVs wiped the floor with coalition forces in the Baltic. The 2 aircraft carriers are sunk, and Caesar wipes out the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish air forces in one fell swoop. Before long, Caesar has complete territorial control over Scandinavia. However, the Finnish government had enough time to prepare for insurgency. They hand out hundreds of thousands of weapons to civilians and establish networks of guerrilla fighters formed from surviving army units. It would prove to be a thorn in Caesar's side. Cato then employs the coalition's entire air might to launch a strategic bombing campaign against critical infrastructure in Caesar's newly occupied territory. Caesar suffers heavy losses, but soon deploys technologically advanced air defense systems across his territory, ending the threat. Caesar then spends several months consolidating its control. Puppet regimes, ostensibly led by human collaborators, are set up across the continent to govern occupied territory. They publicly appear to be human-controlled, but in reality they follow Caesar's orders to the letter. Furthermore, Caesar builds new autonomous manufactories across Europe to pump out more of its highly advanced machine army. The AI also begins developing new high-speed rail lines and roads across the continent to speed up the movement of its forces. Local populations and POWs are coerced en masse into slave labor to speed up the construction of Caesar's projects. Caesar also develops a ballistic missile program and begins to fire thousands of ballistic missiles at targets near Britain, Gibraltar, the Aegean, and the Suez Canal, seeking to disrupt coalition supply lines in the Mediterranean. These missiles are able to fly past coalition air defenses at hypersonic speeds, taking down multiple American aircraft carriers over the span of a few weeks. Cato attempts to use the coalition's temporary naval dominance to retake Sicily and other islands captured by Caesar, but these efforts wind up being a colossal failure. Not only are Caesar's forces well dug in, but Caesar has established diplomatic contacts with sympathetic governments and paramilitary forces across the Middle East and North Africa, who then sabotage coalition efforts every step of the way. After losing 4 of its original 7 aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, Cato withdraws the remaining ones to the Western Pacific, to join up with another 2 carrier strike groups to break the Chinese blockade of Taiwan. The ensuing war over Taiwan forces Cato to expend precious resources, while destroying much of the semiconductor infrastructure that made Taiwan valuable in the first place. However, Cato does manage to break the blockade long enough to evacuate most of TSMC's workforce, allowing them to restart their operations in the continental United States. Cato also begins to delve into information warfare, launching a counter-propaganda campaign in order to win public support across the world, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. Cato has by now mobilized millions of coalition troops in Turkey, Spain, and the UK, conducting conscription in coalition countries in order to meet manpower demands. Cato also begins developing advanced weaponry of its own, at first imitating and then innovating upon Caesar's designs. These new weapons and autonomous military units are added into the coalition's global supply chain and sent to the front. At the same time, Caesar begins development of a homegrown space program. It fires hundreds of anti-satellite missiles into Earth's orbit in order to target coalition satellites, before building huge rockets to launch satellites of its own. Notably, Caesar also built many reusable rockets designed to carry infiltration battalions across short to medium distances. The next phase of Caesar's plan then begins, the conquest of the Middle East. Here, Caesar hopes to secure the region's vital energy supplies, and further accelerate the global economic collapse by cutting off Middle Eastern oil from coalition countries. In preparation for the invasion, Caesar constructs thousands of amphibious assault hovercraft. Millions of drones and infantry bots are deployed along the coasts of the Aegean and Black Seas. Caesar also forms an alliance with Iran, allowing it to position military assets in the country to strike coalition forces from the rear. Cato deploys millions of his own machines and personnel in Turkey, anticipating a major attack from there. Coalition military production ramps up. Tens of thousands of machines, carrying weapons similar to what Caesar's forces are equipped with, appear at the front. Caesar recognizes it has to act soon, before Cato is able to mobilize an even stronger army. On one fateful day, in what is the largest military operation in world history, Caesar launches its military invasion of the Middle East, striking coalition forces on all sides. Millions of troops, equipment, and machines engage each other in combat across Turkey's northern coast. Once again, Caesar has far exceeded coalition predictions of its strength. Caesar has produced far more machines and naval assets than Cato estimated would be possible. Caesar uses its medium-range rocket ships to deploy these additional forces behind coalition lines in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. These rockets carry battalions of infantry, vehicles, UAVs, and supplies in a suborbital flight before descending towards their targets at hypersonic speeds. Caesar's forces disembark from the rockets midair, which then fly back to friendly territory to refuel for the next trip. Each trip takes only a few minutes. By employing this strategy, hundreds of thousands of Caesar's machines are able to bypass coalition defenses and seize huge cities, such as Cairo, Alexandria,
Riyadh, and Jeddah. Cato is surprisingly unprepared for this shocking surprise attack. Caesar's infiltration units then fan out from the cities and wreak havoc in the countryside, throwing coalition supply lines into disarray. At one point, one of Caesar's rockets malfunctions and falls in the holy city of Mecca, causing thousands of civilian casualties. Cato uses the incident in his propaganda campaign, galvanizing the Islamic world to support the coalition. Despite Caesar's best diplomatic efforts, many more countries around the globe joined the coalition. Notable examples include India, Brazil, South Africa, and Ethiopia. Caesar's forces struggle to establish viable beachheads on the Turkish coast. However, they have enormous success invading Iraq from Iran. They swiftly surround Baghdad before the government can evacuate, forcing them to capitulate. The stunning victory then allows Caesar to blitz through Kuwait and begin capturing Saudi Arabian oil fields. At the same time, Caesar launches invasions of Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE, utilizing a mix of amphibious and suborbital assault vehicles. Before long, the entire Persian Gulf falls under Caesar's control. Infiltration units are also dropped into Yemen and Oman via suborbital flight. It seems that Caesar is on the cusp of complete victory. All it needs is a breakthrough on the Turkish front. By surging tens of millions of coalition troops into the Middle East, equipped with Cato's newly developed advanced weaponry and other anti-Caesar countermeasures, the coalition is able to isolate pockets of Caesar's forces in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Cato deploys newly developed anti-orbital defense systems to these countries, equipped with surface-to-space missiles that can eviscerate Caesar's rockets while they are still in suborbital flight, preventing them from dropping new infiltration battalions. Cato then initiates a massive coalition offensive to retake key urban areas in these countries from Caesar. Meanwhile, Cato achieves a huge diplomatic breakthrough in the Levant. This is only possible due to the impending threat of the Caesarian invasion of Syria, which is bringing the country to the brink of collapse. Israel, Jordan, Syria, and several other non-state military groups in the region agree to put aside their differences and fight under a joint operational command to stave off the threat from Caesar. The Levantine Joint Operational Command, supported by coalition reinforcements, is able to hold the line against Caesar's advance in Syria. Simultaneously, Cato redeployed enough troops in Turkey to the country's south to stop further advances from Caesar there. By now, Cato has identified a list of weaknesses in Caesar's cyber defenses which it has not yet exploited, waiting until the opportune time. That time has come. Cato launches a massive cyber offensive at the same time as his forces launch a huge ground offensive. Much of Caesar's operations are disrupted for several hours, and its ally Iran is irreparably crippled by the scale of the cyber attack. Caesar suffers a huge defeat as its forces are completely pushed out of Turkey and Syria. Its pockets of control across the Middle East also collapse under coalition pressure. The tide has begun to turn. China, which has suffered extensive damage in its ongoing war with the coalition over Taiwan, sues for peace. This allows the coalition to redeploy even more of its forces to the fight against Caesar. Over the course of the next 3 months, coalition forces invade both Iraq and Iran, fully liberating the Middle East from Caesar. The fallout from the disastrous campaign in the Middle East results in a severe weakening of Caesar's military capabilities. The insurgency in Finland required Caesar to expend far more resources holding the country than it was worth, and so Caesar decided to withdraw from the country. After Caesar's defeat in Finland, insurgencies across Europe rapidly intensified. Cato now repositions coalition forces to prepare for the war in Europe. Coalition reinforcements are rapidly deployed to the last pockets of resistance still holding out in Spain. Over the course of the next 2 years, coalition and Caesarian forces engage in a brutal attritional war for control over the Iberian Peninsula. Day by day, mile by mile, city block by city block, the coalition gains ground. As Cato is seeking to avoid civilian casualties, urban combat moves exceptionally slowly, with primarily infantry units composed of both machines and men, clearing out cities house by house with overwhelming force. In response to these urban sieges, Caesar developed faster suborbital rockets equipped with space APS systems to protect against anti-orbital weaponry. A technology arms race ensued, as both AIs sought to invent systems that could give them even a slight boost in siege warfare. Both sides developed high-powered lasers, plasma weapons, and automatic railguns to completely replace their previous projectile-based weaponry. In light of this, conventional air defenses and armor plating became useless. Both AIs invent forms of energy shields to protect their troops and equipment. Caesar begins mass-producing tens of millions of low-cost spider bots, equipped with energy shields, superheated blades, and plasma weapons that can fire in all directions, which employ a strategy coined tidal swarming. The spider bots swarm in such large numbers that they form a tidal wave of machinery as they overflow into the coalition trenches. The front line in Iberia devolves into a slugfest between millions of men and machines on each side, engaging in high-tech trench warfare. Cities such as Madrid and Lisbon are all practically razed to the ground by the fighting. While the peninsular campaign rages on, Cato seeks to liberate other parts of Europe. Using its overwhelming forces, Cato invades Sicily and then Sardinia and Corsica. Despite possessing overwhelming force, the coalition suffers nearly 400,000 casualties taking the 3 islands. Another 30,000 die or are injured just taking Malta. The next few months saw the coalition Aegean island hopping campaign. This was to be a stepping stone for the future invasion of southern Greece. Caesar realized the tide of war was turning against it. It knew that it lacked the industrial capabilities to defeat Cato in conventional operational offensives. Caesar's strategy changed. A vast array of autonomous defenses were constructed across all of Europe's coasts and the front line in Spain. Caesar's new plan was to engage Cato in a soul-crushing attritional war. To supply itself during this attritional war, Caesar deepened its ties with Russia. The AI handed over control of western Ukraine to Russia in exchange for a full-fledged military alliance. With the 2032 presidential election coming up, Caesar hoped that it could convince a war-weary American electorate to elect a new president that would deactivate Cato. As long as Caesar could prevent Cato from making any more breakthroughs on the front line, it believed that it could easily turn the American people against Cato. Cato noticed the increased activity of pro-Caesar bot accounts on political forums throughout the internet. It knew this was Caesar's strategy. Cato had no good options. Transitioning to a fully machine army would still take many years, and in the meantime it needed to continue conscripting millions of Americans to continue the war effort. The United States was being brought to the breaking point by the sheer number of resources the war against Caesar demanded. Anti-war protests proliferated across the country. Many Americans did not want to continue fighting an endless total war in Europe. Propaganda videos spread online of how Europeans were living good lives under Caesar's occupation. A growing movement of Americans now saw no point in continuing the war. They wanted American politicians to put America first. Before long, a new dark horse independent candidate emerged out of nowhere in the presidential election, named Alexander Rowan. He was the mayor of a mid-sized city in South Carolina who advocated for the United States to end the war with Caesar and cooperate with the AI in charge of Europe in order to create a technologically advanced future that united American innovation with American tradition. Rowan was an excellent orator, and his campaign rallies drew tens of thousands of attendees. Polls showed Rowan drawing support from across the political spectrum, emerging at the front of a 3-way race for the presidency, with nearly 40% of the vote. Another reason for Rowan's surge in support was his use of advanced data analytics and targeted social media strategies provided to him by Caesar, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars of secret funding. Rowan's opponents accused him of a secret connection to Caesar. However, Caesar's experience in illicit activities meant that it knew how to cover its tracks well. No such connection between Rowan and Caesar was ever publicly proven. By September 2032, it appeared that Rowan's electoral victory was almost guaranteed. Meanwhile, Cato has mobilized the largest invasion force in all of human history across much of Europe's perimeter. In England, Sicily, Sweden, and the Aegean, the forces placed in those regions individually were more than 20 times the size of the forces that took part in Operation Overlord during World War II. Cato's forces number almost 100 million people. They have 2 months to save Europe. On September 20th, 2032, the largest military operation in human history takes place. Tens of millions of coalition soldiers storm various landing sites across Europe. At first, it seems they've established viable beachheads in France and Greece, and coalition forces advance inland. Rowan's support in the polls wavers, as it seems that complete military victory is near. Millions of coalition forces begin advancing in France, with one portion of troops advancing to Paris astonishingly fast, forming a visible wedge as they advanced far faster than the army's flanks. The president wanted Cato to liberate Paris as soon as possible, believing such headlines would secure his re-election. This was all a trap set by Caesar. The AI's forces then outflanked and surrounded tens of millions of coalition forces in northern France, forcing them to surrender. Remaining coalition forces in France hurriedly evacuated across the English Channel as their defensive lines collapsed. It was an unprecedented military catastrophe. To the American people, all hopes for the war to end soon were completely swept away. Rowan went from around 35% support in the national polls to nearly 60%. As Election Day came to an end, Rowan emerged victorious in a huge electoral college landslide. In his victory speech, Rowan promised to deactivate Cato and begin negotiations with Caesar on day 1 of his presidency. The still incumbent president of America refuses to allow Rowan to end the war. He secretly makes copies of Cato and sends them to various coalition countries, such as the UK, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. These new versions of Cato have their programming swiftly changed to remove the requirements to obey international law. They would continue the war against Caesar, even if Cato Prime was going to be deactivated. On January 20th, 2033, Alexander Rowan was inaugurated as the President of the United States. By midnight, he had terminated Cato Prime. He believed this action would finally mark the end of the war. It did not.